Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Today channel. Taylor calls off her wedding to Ridge under pressure from Eric and leaves town. Taylor Hayes was prepared to make to Ridge Forrester, the man who had been the tumultuous epicenter of her emotional universe since their youth, a man for whom she had endured public humiliation, the agony of his infidelities, the shattering heartbreak of divorce, and the complex navigation of blended families, only to find her way back to his side, convinced that this time, after the ashes of his latest catastrophic entanglement with Brooke Logan had settled into a seemingly final smolder, their bond, forged in the crucible of shared history, mutual respect, and undeniable, if complicated, passion, was truly unbreakable, destined to carry them into a serene sunset of shared grandchildren and professional triumphs. Taylor stood poised at the threshold of the grand living room, resplendent in a gown of exquisite simplicity that hugged her figure with elegant grace before flowing into a modest train, her dark hair swept into a sophisticated chignon adorned with a single, perfect pearl, a vision of poised serenity that belied the frantic butterflies dancing in her stomach, her heart pounding a rhythm of nervous anticipation mixed with hard-won certainty, her gaze fixed on the imposing figure of Ridge at the far end of the aisle, flanked by his brothers and sons, his expression radiating a confidence that momentarily soothed her nerves, whispering a silent affirmation that this was right. This was their destiny finally claiming its due, the gentle strains of a string quartet swelled, filling the air with a melody both tender and triumphant, a soundtrack to the moment she had fought for, prayed for, and believed was irrevocably hers, a moment where the ghosts of Brooke Logan and the painful past would finally be laid to rest, replaced by the solid reality of her place as Ridge Forrester's wife, the legitimate matriarch of the Forrester dynasty she had served and loved for so long, guests, a curated assembly of Los Angeles elite, fashion icons, and the complex tapestry of the Forrester, Logan, and Spector families, shifted in their seats, anticipation palpable, smiles warm and expectant, ready to witness the sealing of a union many felt was long overdue, a testament to enduring love conquering relentless adversity. Yet, just as Taylor took her first deliberate step forward, her hand trembling slightly on her father's arm, the heavy weight of Eric Forrester's presence materialized beside her, not as the benevolent patriarch offering a proud escort, but as a spectral figure emanating an aura of profound sorrow and desperate urgency, his usually warm blue eyes clouded with an anguish so deep it seemed to physically bow his shoulders. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly whisper, strained and thick with unshed tears, cutting through the ceremonial music like a shard of ice, imploring her to pause, to listen, his gnarled hand gently but firmly grasping her elbow, not to guide her forward, but to hold her back from the precipice she was about to leap from. "Taylor, my dear, dear girl," he breathed, his words heavy with paternal affection laced with unbearable pain, "please, just one moment, before you do this. I need you to understand something crucial, something that tears at my very soul to say." His gaze, filled with a terrifying mixture of love and despair, locked onto hers, compelling her attention away from the radiant vision of Ridge waiting expectantly, his expression shifting from confidence to puzzled concern as he noticed the delay, the subtle tension rippling through the assembled guests who began to murmur softly, sensing a disruption in the carefully choreographed proceedings. Eric, leaning closer, his voice dropping even lower, became the sole focus of Taylor's universe, the music fading into a distant hum, the vibrant colors of the flowers bleaching into insignificance. "What you're about to do, marrying Ridge, it's a mistake, Taylor. A devastating mistake. Not because you don't love him, or he you, in his way. But because he doesn't know himself." Eric's voice cracked, his eyes welling, he's standing there believing it, wanting it now, in this moment, with all the conviction he can muster. "But I know my son, Taylor. I know his heart, his patterns, his fatal flaw. The specter of Brooke, it's not gone. It's merely dormant, lying in wait. And the moment this ceremony ends, the moment the reality of forever sets in, that dormant seed will sprout. He'll start questioning, doubting, looking back. The allure of the unresolved, the toxic pull of that Logan woman, it's in his blood, Taylor. It's a compulsion he cannot break, not truly, not permanently." Eric's grip tightened slightly, his words pouring forth with the desperate intensity of a man trying to avert a tragedy he sees unfolding in agonizing slow motion. I see the shadow already, Taylor. I see it flicker in his eyes when her name is mentioned, in the set of his jaw when he thinks no one is looking. He wants to be free of it, he wants this life with you, but the wanting isn't enough to overcome the ingrained pull. If you marry him today, you are signing up for a lifetime of being second best. A lifetime of waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Brooke to snap her fingers and watch him crumble. Is that what you deserve? After everything you've given this family, after the loyalty, the forgiveness, the unwavering strength? You deserve a man whose heart is wholly, unequivocally yours. Not a man perpetually haunted, perpetually divided. You deserve peace, Taylor. True peace. Not this gilded cage of inevitable heartbreak. Eric's plea was a masterclass in emotional manipulation disguised as profound paternal care, each word meticulously chosen to exploit Taylor's deepest insecurities, her most profound fears cultivated over years of being the reliable second choice. The woman Ridge returned to only after Brooke had shattered him or he had shattered her, the fear that her hard-won victory was merely a pause, not a conclusion. He painted a vivid picture of a future steeped in quiet desperation, of watching Ridge's gaze drift, of sensing his restless spirit chafing against the bonds of their marriage even as she tried to hold him close, the specter of Brooke Logan forever a third, unwelcome presence in their bed, their home, their lives. He spoke of her worth, her dignity, the immense respect and genuine love he held for her as a daughter, emphasizing that watching her walk into this guaranteed pain was tearing him apart, that his intervention, however brutal, however ill-timed, was the only true act of love he could offer her at this critical juncture, saving her from the slow, soul-crushing erosion of self that marrying a fundamentally unavailable Ridge would inevitably inflict. The impact of Eric's words was catastrophic, detonating within Taylor like a silent bomb, shattering the fragile edifice of confidence and hope she had meticulously built in the lead-up to this day. His arguments, delivered with such raw, seemingly selfless anguish, resonated with the dark whispers of doubt she had fought so hard to suppress. The fear that Ridge's proposal, his apparent certainty, was born more from exhaustion with the Brooke Ridge-Taylor merry-go-round, or a desire for stability, than from a genuine, singular, irrevocable love for her. The image Eric conjured, of a future where she remained perpetually vigilant, perpetually insecure, perpetually waiting for Brooke's shadow to reclaim Ridge, was horrifyingly plausible, a chilling confirmation of her worst nightmares. The radiant certainty that had illuminated her moments before evaporated, replaced by a chilling wave of nausea and a profound sense of devastating clarity that felt less like revelation and more like a death sentence. She looked past Eric towards Ridge, who was now frowning deeply, taking a step forward, confusion and dawning alarm replacing his earlier confidence, but instead of seeing her rock, her future, she suddenly saw the man Eric described, inherently conflicted, perpetually drawn to the flame that had burned him countless times, a man whose forever was always conditional, always vulnerable to Brooke Logan's gravitational pull. The love she felt for him didn't vanish, but it twisted into something agonizing, laced with the bitter poison of Eric's prophecy. The weight of the gown, the pearls, the expectation, the decades of history, suddenly felt suffocating. An elaborate costume for a role she could no longer bring herself to play, the understanding wife, the forgiving partner. The woman who patiently waits her turn in the endless cycle of Ridge's affections. The applause, the smiles, the promise of happily ever after curdled into a grotesque parody. In that suspended moment, amidst the bewildered murmurs of the guests and Ridge's increasingly concerned calls of her name, Taylor made a decision born not of anger, but of a profound, soul-deep exhaustion and a desperate, self-preserving instinct, with a strength that seemed to materialize from the core of her despair. She pulled her arm gently but firmly from Eric's grasp, meeting his tear-filled eyes not with accusation, but with a bleak, terrifying emptiness that was far more devastating than any outburst. She didn't speak to him, didn't acknowledge Ridge's approaching figure or the gasps rippling through the crowd. Instead, she turned on her heel, the delicate silk of her gown whispering against the floor like a sigh of surrender, her movements deliberate, almost trance-like, as she walked not towards the altar, but back down the short aisle she had just traversed, away from Ridge, away from the future she had envisioned, away from the suffocating grandeur of the Forrester mansion and the unbearable weight of its patriarch's devastating prediction. Her exit was neither dramatic nor hysterical. It was a silent, palpable unraveling, a retreat into the depths of her own shattered spirit, She moved through the stunned silence like a ghost, her face a mask of frozen devastation. Eyes wide and unseeing, tears beginning a silent, relentless trek down her cheeks, each step a renunciation of everything she had believed was finally within her grasp. She ignored the bewildered whispers, the outstretched hands offering comfort or seeking explanation, the confused calls of Steffi and Thomas from the front rows. She simply walked, purposefully yet brokenly, out of the living room, through the grand foyer, and out the imposing front doors into the blinding California sunlight. Leaving behind the gasps, the rising tide of confused conversation, Ridge frozen mid-aisle, his face a portrait of stunned disbelief rapidly morphing into dawning horror and desperate confusion, and Eric, standing alone where he had intercepted her, his head bowed, shoulders shaking with silent sobs, consumed by the terrible conviction that he had done the necessary, merciful thing, even as he witnessed the immediate, catastrophic fallout of his intervention. Taylor didn't pause on the manicured lawn. She moved with eerie determination towards her car, parked discreetly away from the valet line designated for guests. Fumbling with the door handle in her elegant gloves, she finally wrenched it open, collapsing into the driver's seat, the pristine white of her wedding gown a stark, incongruous contrast against the leather upholstery. Only then, in the sudden, suffocating silence of the car, insulated from the chaos erupting inside the mansion, did the full force of the devastation hit her. A ragged, guttural sob tore from her throat, followed by another, racking her body as she buried her face in her hands, the carefully applied makeup dissolving into streaks of black and beige. The enormity of what she had just done, walking away from Ridge, from her children witnessing this public humiliation, from the life she had meticulously planned, crashed over her in waves of unbearable pain and terrifying uncertainty. Eric's words echoed relentlessly in her mind, reinforcing her decision yet amplifying the agony. You deserve peace, not this gilded cage of inevitable heartbreak. The thought of facing anyone, Ridge, her children, Brooke, who would inevitably hear, inevitably gloat, or worse, pity, the Forrester employees, the LA gossip mill already doubtless buzzing, was utterly paralyzing. The mansion, the city itself, felt toxic, saturated with the history of her pain, Ridge's indecision, Brooke's presence, and now the crushing weight of Eric's mercy. She couldn't go home, couldn't face Steffi's justified anger or Thomas's bewildered hurt. She needed distance, vast and absolute, a space devoid of Forrester influence and Logan ghosts, a place to breathe air untainted by decades of emotional warfare. With trembling hands, ignoring the tears blurring her vision, she started the car. The engine's purr felt alien, a mundane sound in the midst of her personal apocalypse. Without a conscious plan, only a desperate, animalistic need to flee. She shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb, accelerating down the tree-lined street away from the Forrester estate, the manicured lawns and palatial homes blurring into insignificance. She drove aimlessly at first, fueled by pure adrenaline and despair, the city streets passing in a haze of tears and fragmented thoughts, the image of Ridge's stunned face superimposed on every stoplight. Gradually, a direction emerged from the chaos of her mind, the freeway on-ramp leading out, away from Los Angeles, away from the suffocating familiarity. She merged onto the highway, pressing the accelerator harder, the speed a feeble attempt to outrun the crushing weight of her decision, the devastating finality of walking away, the terrifying vacuum of a future she could no longer envision. The iconic skyline receded in her rearview mirror, not with a sense of liberation, but with the profound melancholy of a chapter violently, irrevocably closed, leaving behind only wreckage, unanswered questions, and the haunting echo of Eric Forrester's devastatingly effective plea that had shattered her dream and sent her fleeing into an uncertain, solitary horizon. The white wedding gown an incongruous shroud for her escape, a stark symbol of love sacrificed on the altar of a patriarch's grim prophecy and her own heartbreakingly realized self-worth. Taylor Hayes and Rich Forrester instead became a moment etched in heartbreak, as the carefully arranged ceremony dissolved under the weight of unspoken truths and the commanding presence of Eric, whose intervention carried both the authority of a patriarch and the desperation of a man who could not bear to see his family unravel further. And as Taylor stood before her guests in the ornate Forrester mansion, swathed in a gown that seemed to hold more symbolism than satin, she felt the pressure of every eye upon her, Ridge's searching gaze filled with love and expectation, Eric's stern expression conveying both his paternal concern and an almost ruthless determination. Brooke's presence like a shadow at the edge of the room, reminding Taylor of the triangle that had defined so much of her adult life, and it was in that suffocating silence, broken only by the murmurs of family and the hushed sweep of the piano music lingering in the background, that Taylor's heart began to fracture. The doubts she had buried surfacing with such intensity she could hardly breathe, and though she loved Ridge with a devotion she had fought to defend time and time again, she could no longer deny the gnawing sense that this union, forced into existence under such tangled circumstances, could never truly bring peace, and so when Eric's words, heavy with implication, urged her to reconsider, to reflect not just on her love for Ridge but on the chaos, the pain, and the fractured loyalties that would inevitably follow, Taylor felt a wave of clarity that was as devastating as it was liberating, for she realized that to marry Ridge in that moment would not be an act of triumph or devotion but of surrender to a cycle that had consumed her, a cycle that left her forever in competition with Brooke and forever bound by the family's relentless expectations, and with her hands trembling, her bouquet slipping slightly in her grasp, she turned to Ridge, whose face shifted from confusion to alarm. And she whispered words that seemed to echo louder than any vow, telling him she could not go through with it, that her love for him was real but insufficient against the storm that surrounded them, and as gasps rippled through the crowd and Ridge reached for her, begging her to reconsider, Eric stepped forward, not triumphant but sorrowful, for he had not wanted this scene to play out so publicly yet had known it was inevitable, and Taylor, choking back tears that blurred her vision, dropped the bouquet entirely, the petals scattering like the remnants of a dream at her feet, and she fled the room, her gown trailing like a ghost behind her, her heart breaking not just for herself but for the man she was leaving behind, and though Ridge called after her, his voice raw with anguish, she did not stop, could not stop, for every step she took away from that mansion was a step away from the suffocating grip of the Forrester saga, and when at last she slipped into her car and drove into the Los Angeles night, she felt both shattered and strangely free, knowing that in calling off the wedding and leaving town she had chosen self-preservation over sacrifice, truth over illusion, and though her absence would leave Ridge bereft and the family divided, it was perhaps the only choice she could have made, for to marry him under such circumstances would have been to betray not just herself but the very love she had once believed could save them both, and so as the city lights blurred past her tear-filled eyes, Taylor carried with her not the memory of a ruined wedding but the haunting knowledge that sometimes the greatest act of love is to walk away. Taylor Hayes stood at the precipice of a decision that would alter the entire course of her life, a decision that had not come easily, nor quickly, but rather after countless hours of torment, reflection, and anguished persuasion from those who claimed to love her most, and yet in their concern had forced her into a corner where love, duty, loyalty, and self-preservation collided in a storm of unbearable weight. She had dreamt of her wedding to Ridge Forrester as the culmination of a love story marked by passion, obstacles, and an almost fated inevitability, and as she prepared to walk down the aisle, she could not deny the swelling of her heart at the thought of finally becoming his wife, finally claiming a future she had longed for, and yet there was Eric Forrester, patriarch, father figure, moral compass, and the man whose influence in the family carried with it both tenderness and an authority impossible to ignore, standing firm, resolute, and unyielding in his conviction that the union she sought would not only tear apart the delicate fabric of the Forrester family but also doom Taylor to a cycle of heartache she did not deserve. His words, gentle yet sharp, compassionate yet damning, echoed through her mind like a steady drumbeat, reminding her that Ridge's heart was forever tethered to Brooke Logan in a way that no vows, no rings, no ceremonies could ever undo, and though Ridge had begged her to trust in him, to believe that his love was strong enough to conquer the shadows of his past and the temptations of his eternal connection to Brooke, Taylor felt the tremors of doubt claw at her spirit, reminding her of every time Ridge had strayed, every time Brooke had re-entered the picture, every time her own happiness had been overshadowed by the history she could never erase. On the morning of what should have been her most joyous day, Taylor looked at herself in the mirror, the veil trembling slightly as though even the delicate fabric could sense her turmoil. And she asked herself whether love was enough when trust had been broken so many times, whether devotion could heal wounds that had been reopened again and again, whether she had the strength to compete with a bond that was as much destiny as it was desire. And as she stood before Ridge at the altar, the music swelling, the guests waiting with bated breath, Eric's gaze found hers from across the room, steady, imploring, silently urging her to see reason, to recognize that this was not salvation, but sacrifice, not triumph but tragedy waiting to unfold, and in that charged, unbearable silence, Taylor felt her resolve collapse under the weight of truth she could no longer deny, and with a voice trembling but clear, she called off the wedding, shocking Ridge, stunning the guests, and silencing the room in an instant. Tears burned her eyes as she confessed that she could not move forward, that the doubts had become too strong, that Eric's words had taken root in her soul and convinced her she deserved a love untainted by betrayal, a love not shared with another, a love that would not require her to fight endlessly for a man's divided heart. And though Ridge reached for her, pleading, desperate to salvage the dream slipping through his fingers, Taylor pulled back, shaking her head with a finality that left no room for negotiation, and in that moment she chose herself, chose dignity over longing, clarity over illusion, strength over weakness, and the courage to walk away from the man she loved because she could no longer bear the cost of holding on. The aftermath was chaos, whispers and gasps echoing through the Grand Forester estate, Ridge storming after her, demanding explanations, demanding she listen to him rather than Eric, but Taylor's resolve, once fragile, had hardened into steel, and she told him with heartbreaking calm that she could no longer live in the shadow of his eternal triangle, that she refused to build a marriage haunted by Brooke's ghost, that she could not, in good conscience, tie her future to a man who, no matter how much he professed to love her, would always, in some secret, unspoken corner of his heart, be pulled toward another woman. Ridge, stunned, wounded, unable to form words, could only watch as Taylor, still in her wedding gown, turned away and walked out of the Forester home, the train of her dress sweeping behind her like a final curtain falling on a play that had run its course. And though Eric stood silently, knowing his influence had guided her to this choice, he felt no triumph, only sorrow, because he loved them both and knew the pain he had helped cause, but also believed with unshakable certainty that in the long run, Taylor would thank him for helping her escape a destiny of disappointment. Outside, the California sun beat down with cruel brightness, the world carrying on as though her own had not shattered, and Taylor realized that to truly heal, she could not stay in Los Angeles, surrounded by memories, surrounded by the constant pull of Ridge and Brooke's orbit. So with trembling hands and a heart that felt both heavy and strangely free, she packed her belongings, kissed her children goodbye with promises that she would return, and left town, disappearing into the horizon with the vow to find herself again, to reclaim her independence, to step away from the drama that had defined her life for too long. Her departure was not just physical but symbolic, a declaration that she would no longer be defined by Ridge's choices or Eric's influence or Brooke's shadow, but by her own strength, her own path, her own rediscovered identity. And though Ridge would rage, plead, and perhaps even pursue her, though the Forester family would debate endlessly whether Eric had done the right thing, though whispers of scandal would ripple through the social circles of Los Angeles, Taylor carried with her a quiet, fierce determination that this was not an ending but a beginning, not a loss but a liberation, not the close of her love story but the first chapter in a new one. And as the city faded in her rearview mirror, she allowed herself a fragile smile through the tears, knowing that sometimes the bravest act of love is not to cling, but to let go.